World Geography, Africa, Imperialism. Here are the learning objectives. 1. Describe the triangular trade between Africa and the Americas. 2. Distinguish between imperialism and colonialism. 3. What was the purpose of the Berlin Conference? 4. How does South African apartheid compare to the racism and discrimination which existed in the United States prior to the Civil Rights Movement? 5. Identify the roots of the genocide in Rwanda. 6. How does a failed state act as a haven for terrorists? Contact with outsiders. Early trade. The earliest African trade with the outside world occurred before the 15th century. Gold, copper, ivory, these simple items were traded with merchants arriving from Arabia and India. European arrival. The earliest European explorers of the African continent were in pursuit of resources. By the 1600s, a European-controlled triangular trade existed between Africa and the Americas. Gunpowder and rum would arrive in West Africa and be exchanged for enslaved Africans. The number of persons sold into slavery is estimated to be between 10 to 25 million. Here's a map of the triangular trade between the Americas and Africa. You can look at it closely. Industrialization. By the mid-1800s, industrialization drove more Europeans further into the interior of Africa. They were searching for cheap natural resources and raw materials for use in their new factories. Remember that the Industrial Revolution was the rapid development of industry brought about by the introduction of machinery. It was characterized by use of steam power, the growth of factories, and the mass production of manufactured goods. And here's an example of industrialization in England. Definitions. Imperialism and colonialism. Both these terms, imperialism and colonialism, describe the state of relations between Africa and Europe from their first period of contact to the end of World War II. Imperialism. Imperialism is the exercise of power by a state beyond its borders. You could look at it as the domination by one country of the political, economic, and cultural life of another country. If you look at like the American occupation of Afghanistan, that's somewhat imperialist in nature. It's the exercise of America of power beyond its own borders in Afghanistan, and it influences their culture. Colonialism. Colonialism is one step up from the stage of imperialism. It involves more direct political control over the nation by powers which reside in another nation. So America is not the colonial master of Afghanistan. They still have their own politicians and elect their own leaders, have their own courts, their own military, things like that. More of a colonial type relationship is the relationship that England had with its 13 colonies here in the Americas. That was colonialism. And the resources of the colonized country, in that case the Americas, the 13 colonies, those resources are used to strengthen and enrich the colonial power, England in this case. Berlin Conference. Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. His idea was to call on representatives from several European countries and the United States, and also the Ottoman Empire, to take part in a large conference called the Berlin Conference. The aim of the conference was that they were going to discuss European colonization and trade in Africa. The United States wasn't interested in being a colonial power, so they did not attend the conference. Also, with no Africans in attendance, just European powers, the continent was divided up amongst them, and several European countries acquired vast new territories on the African continent. Here you can see an example of a map of colonialism in 1914, and you can see by the key that the land is being occupied or colonized by several different European powers. Principle of effectivity. According to this principle of effectivity, European powers could hold African colonies only if they actually possessed them. So they had to prove that they possessed them to the other European nations. And to prove that, they had to, 1, make treaties with local leaders, 2, fly the national flag in the African territory, 3, establish an administration and police force in the territory, and 4, exploit African resources for the benefit of the colonial power. Colonial motives. Exploitation. The purpose of the European presence in Africa was clearly the exploitation of African resources, both human resources, as in the case of slavery, and natural resources. To realize the agenda of exploitation, colonial administrators, they used forced labor, they stole the land from the natives, tortured people, used practices of unfair taxation. Thousands of African lives were lost in the coal mines, digging up resources for the Europeans. More lives were lost in the construction of roads and railways, which were being built to deliver Africa's resources to the European consumer. Independence. Colonialism ended when Africans demanded independence following the Allied victory in World War II. Lots of the European nations were exhausted from the war. They were interested in building up their own local economies at home in Europe, had to rebuild their infrastructure in Europe. So they really weren't interested in holding on to colonies overseas at this point. They didn't really have the means to do that anymore. Had to focus their attention at home. So the African nations, lots of colonies actually around the world at this time, became independent. And unfortunately in Africa, a large minority of Europeans continued to hold most of the economic power, control the money and the resources. They often would surrender only a little political power to the Africans. Racism still prevented black Africans on their own continent from obtaining decent educations and still forced them into the most menial jobs. Remember that racism is prejudice or discrimination or any antagonism, hatred that's directed against someone of a different race. South African apartheid. Beginning of apartheid. Racial segregation and the supremacy of whites were common in South Africa even prior to 1948. However, the white minority government took things a step further in 1948 and enacted apartheid policies. The whole purpose of apartheid was the complete separation of the races, not only separating the whites from any non-whites, but also separating non-whites from each other, and also separating black Africans of one group from another black African group. They would separate the different black tribes from one another. Everybody had their own separate place to live. Of course, the places where the white people lived were always better than the places where the other groups lived. Separate development. Under what was called the separate development policy, different black African tribal groups, they were relocated to rural reservations, kind of like the Indian reservations here in the United States. These rural reservations that they were forced to return to, these were the places where either their ancestors had come from or where they themselves had come from before they moved to the South African cities. Under apartheid, only black Africans with government labor permits were permitted to live in the urban areas. And even then, they engaged in the most menial labor, yard work, being a maid, things like that. Labor permits, they didn't include the spouse or the family. So the spouse and the family were left behind back on the rural reservation. And this led to the breakup of African family life. Major mineral areas and cities, these were the places reserved for the whites. Protests against apartheid. Of course, this was system was not just accepted by everyone. There were demonstrations against apartheid. Demonstrations were led by labor organizations and student groups, and these were organized worldwide throughout the 1970s and 1980s. International economic sanctions by other countries affected the South African economy. These sanctions raised the cost of necessities for the South African. And sanctions are measures taken by a nation to coerce another to conform to international norms of conduct. Other African nations refused to even trade with South Africa. End of apartheid. South African President F.W. de Klerk, he repealed, under a lot of pressure, he repealed the last of the apartheid laws in 1991. A new constitution was written, and multiracial, multi-party, free elections were held in 1994. The African National Congress, the ANC, led by Nelson Mandela, won the elections and gained majority representation. Nelson Mandela. So who was Nelson Mandela? He spent 27 years as a political prisoner in South Africa, eventually becoming the country's first black president. He was also a leading member of the African National Congress, which strongly opposed the white minority government for many years. The government had outlawed the ANC in 1960 and arrested its leaders, including Mandela. Over the years that he spent in prison, he became a worldwide symbol of resistance to racism. And there you have a picture of Nelson Mandela. Rwandan genocide. Genocide. In 1948, following World War II, the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defined genocide. They called it any act committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Origins of conflict. Around 700 years ago, a minority group called the Tutsis migrated into the area where Rwanda is today, and they soon dominated the majority Hutu group. At the time of independence from the European colonial power in 1962, the Hutu majority, they then assumed political control of Rwanda. And now it was the Tutsi minority who felt unfairly treated, and they formed rebel groups in opposition. Here's a map of the region we're speaking of. Rwanda is a tiny little country, wedged in between kind of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, and Uganda. Try and see if you can find it on this map. Genocide in Rwanda. Hutu President Habyarimana, he signed a power-sharing agreement with the Tutsi rebels in 1993, but soon died in a very suspicious plane crash. Hutus were generally unhappy with the agreement, and Hutu tribal gangs and soldiers, they went on a rampage, and in 100 days they slaughtered an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people. Most victims were either Tutsi or moderate Hutus. The Tutsi-dominated Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, they invaded from bases outside the countries to stop the extermination of civilians. And at that point, then, over 2 million Rwandan Hutus fled into exile. Reasons. So why did the two ethnic groups have such a hatred for one another? Well, it goes back to historical reason. The German and the Belgian colonial authorities, they believed that the Tutsis were more attractive people and that they possessed racial superiority. So in accordance with these beliefs, only Tutsis were permitted to be educated and participate in the government. Colonial policies then created this intense hatred for Tutsis among the majority Hutu. Failed states. Characteristics. Failed states describe countries that have failed at some of the basic conditions and responsibilities of a sovereign government or an independent government. The characteristics of a failed state include loss of physical control over their own territory. It may be like the situation in Iraq at this moment, where the authorities in Baghdad, the capital, seem to have lost control over large parts of the country. Other characteristics of a failed state include no legitimate authority to make collective decisions. Another characteristic, unable to provide reasonable public services. Are there schools being provided? Is there electricity? If not, this might be a failed state. And another final characteristic is the loss of ability to interact internationally with other states. Do other countries want to even have anything to do with you? Here's a map of failed states. The ones that are in deep red are the ones that are in danger of basically collapsing. And then in orange, less danger, yellow, even less, and green, considered to be the very opposite of a failed state. These are the very successful states. Haven for terrorists. After the September 2011 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, leaders around the world began to see failed states as threats to the entire world. The absence of authority in a country tends to leave a vacuum that terrorists can potentially fill. And terrorism is the use of violence and intimidation in the pursuit of political and/or religious aims. The end. Thank you for your attention.